Good afternoon, good morning, good evening, depending on where you are when you're seeing this live, hopefully. This is Andy Revkin on the climate beat since the 1980s. I looked back, it's actually half of my life right now. I'm a Medicare, Social Security guy. And so it's a big chunk of my life is figuring out what's going on with the climate system and what's going on with efforts to react to it, to what's going on. And I've been talking more and more with social scientists in order to get an understanding of the social climate side of the climate problem. And it became pretty clear to me, really starting in 2006, 2009, that, oh my God, this is the big deal. If you're not focused on how people react or don't react to risk, how they define solutions, then you're really screwed thinking about climate change. And I'm really happy to have, for, I don't know, the fourth time maybe, Dana Fisher on the show on Sustain What, this enterprise that is trying to navigate toward impact through conversation around these issues. And Dana had been at University of Maryland and is now at American University in Washington, D.C., building a new program, all kinds of exciting things to talk about. And it's great to have you here because a big focus of your work, even preceding climate, is movements, social activism around issues ranging from civil rights to women's rights and now climate justice and the like. It's great to have you here. And you have a book out, which will be a big focus of our chat. So first of all, how are you doing?
I'm good. Thank you for having me. It's great to be back. I remember, I think the first time I was on Sustain What, I came in and we were talking about our work on the IPCC, and I ran in coming off of seeing the dentist, and then did one of these things where I was talking about my head exploding about the research that we were doing or what we were trying to do for the IPCC, and that ended up being a GIF that you put up a bunch of times.
I mean, was it? It became a GIF? I got to see that.
Well, it was just funny because I remember I was talking about trying to measure the actual effects of climate action from social movements and civic actors. And I remember I was trying to explain, and I was just saying, the idea that we can actually measure it, and I did one of these, like my head explodes when I try to think about all the data and how we have to think through all these different variables to get to an answer. And everybody went, so it was a funny one. You put it up a couple times. So anyway, yes, but that was my first time here. And that was when we were working on the IPCC AR6, I think is when I first joined. And it was a couple of us, I think. Ed Carr was on, and I forget
who's just moved into the non-academic sector. He's
Stockholm Environment, right?
In Washington, D.C. And I'm going to have him on soon to say, what is the Stockholm Environment Institute doing in D.C.? So
I'm excited. Yeah, I know some people who are working with them out in on the West Coast. So I'm excited. I'm hoping he and I can get together at some point.
Yeah, and that was a really important point because you were addressing a key question that the IPCC hadn't looked at before, which is, does movement making, does climate activism have an impact on the climate? I think that was the question on the floor, and the answer was a big, we don't know.
Exactly. Unfortunately, the question is still kind of a we don't know, although we got what I think came out of the AR6 was we got to know how much we didn't know, but what kind of questions we needed to ask. And I actually have been working with a bunch of folks in different agencies under the Biden administration to start to measure civic action around climate. So not activism per se, but action. And you know, these groups, the different climate corps that are now, the corps that are now becoming part of the American Climate Corps. I've been studying them with the National Park Service, the U.S. Forest Service, and the AmeriCorps. And we're actually trying to start to look at that type of civic work and put measurements on that. So it builds directly off of the work that I did with the IPCC because we really didn't know enough. And so we actually, one of my project managers been spending his time like sifting through the kind of data that these programs collect about what they do for the climate to see what we can actually measure and what we need to measure. Because we still don't have the answers, but we at least are starting to know where to look. And we're starting to try to cull that because particularly around things like the Climate Corps, you need to be able to say, what did the Climate Corps do, right? Well, it gave a certain number of people jobs, and this is the kind of work they did, and this is the career trajectory it put them on. And this is the amount of either the amount of carbon that it mitigated against, or this is the kind of adaptation measures that were taken, and this is why they matter. And so we have to start doing that. So that's what we're working on now. And it builds right off of that work.
Especially doing that, especially if it's longitudinal work where you're keeping track, because even the IPCC, they didn't let. So I think it was Naomi Oreskes had pushed for the IPCC to open its own process through these years to social science to understand the dynamics of the process itself and how it interrelated with the world, and that hadn't really happened. So the more we're tracking these things through time, I think the better, which is good. We'll have to check back on
it. I think it's really valuable. It's not easy work, and I have to say that, like I said before, it was hard to measure. We hadn't really asked the questions. There wasn't a lot of funding for it, but I actually have to say that I've been very lucky that I have a lot of support from AmeriCorps to specifically do this now, which has been wonderful because it gives us the ability to ask these questions and have the time to look at it and then to start to track it over time, which is so necessary for thinking about it.
Well, and I mean, we could go on and on about this, but even the Inflation Reduction Act, tracking the social dynamics around how in red or blue communities, how as that money flows, how that has wider reverberations or not.
I think that what I think is very interesting is that you could track both the social side, but then how the social side ostensibly is leading to the environmental side, right? Because that at least is the argument.
Sure. So let's start with a little bit of a history on you. Again, what has driven you to focus on activism itself as a focal point for your scholarship? Saving Ourselves, your new book, is in a line of books. American Resistance probably being, I don't know if that's the best known, but so what drew you to this arena? And then we can get in on the book.
Well, so I started out here in DC a long, long time ago, at the beginning of the Clinton administration, the first one, before the blue dress. And I was working for an environmental group, and I was actually working on the clean energy budget back after the BTU tax failed. You probably remember that. Everybody else probably does not. And so I was in the civil society sector, and then I worked for a think tank out in Berkeley, California. So I went to graduate school to understand how social processes around the environment work, not activism per se, but I had been in the civic sector and worked with nonprofits and think tanks. So that was one of the questions that I had. And when I wrote my dissertation, which is that first book on the left there, National Governance in the Global Climate Change Regime, it was about the different social actors that were involved in decision-making around the Kyoto Protocol. And I looked in 3 specific countries. I was in the US, Japan, the Netherlands. And in a lot of ways, it was like the first sociological study that looked at the domestic policy making around climate change that was weighing in on this discussion around the climate regime. And in it is funny because I did collect data on activists, but one of my advisors told me to take it out because it didn't really fit in the book. And so, so I have throughout my whole career been studying climate policy making and the ways that non-state actors, particularly civic actors, are trying to push through internal and external channels to put pressure on decision making around climate and the environment. But in my dissertation book, there was too much there, so I took it out, and I ended up writing a couple papers. And then I actually have since in my career kind of bounced back and forth between my second book was Activism Inc., which was about activism. And there was some environment in there, but it was more activism focused. And then I went back and did urban environmental stewardship and civic engagement, which was, it was environmental and civic, but not around activism. And then American Resistance was very much activism there. But I mean, so point being that I've done both sides, and through the whole thing, I've continued to study political elites working on climate and climate policy making. So as I said in a recent paper that we're still waiting to get reviews back on, this is the first time I actually got to study a policy instrument that is the IRA that got passed. So I have a series of papers I've published on failed efforts
That's
through wax and
interesting.
malarkey. Yeah. So it's funny because I was like, okay, so we finally got something that got passed. So I've done both. And the one thing that was very interesting about writing Saving Ourselves is that historically I tend to have the data separate. Either it's on policymaking or it's on the activism. And it's not really on how they're interacting with one another. But in this book, I wanted to bring them together to tell kind of a more coherent story about where we are on this journey through the climate crisis and what's needed to get us to the other side.
Right. So we're going to get into the sort of the heart of the book in a couple minutes, but I wanted to ask you a question that I had to ponder as a journalist a long time ago. It's clear you care about the issues that we're focused on here: climate, human rights, justice. And I back in 2005, Willamette University out west invited me to a meeting on balancing the personal and the professional. And the question they had for me was, as a journalist, how do you mesh your passion for the environment that you care about? That's why you're writing about it, and the need for detachment. And I wrote a long essay about that. Well, I gave a talk and turned it into an essay. So I was wondering, in your case, you're at these rallies.
I can't believe you have that picture.
Sorry,
that's a picture up there is against the Mountain Valley Pipeline. I can't believe you have that picture there.
There, I was Googling away, and there you go. So how do you balance, and how do you? I'm sure you think about this. This book is both it's a guide, it's a blueprint for activism, saying this is what we know and don't know, as well as an analysis of it. So you're cheering people, you're cheering on the movement even as you're doing the work. How do you do that?
That's a great question. I mean, so the way I think about the new book is I think about it as a well-documented manifesto. So right. The well-documented part is the part where, so you have actually here, this is great, I can use these pictures. So what you have in these pictures here is you have two examples of me collecting data at different protest events. One of them is at the March for Science, that's where it's raining. And that was really unfortunate because we were just collecting data with our new tablets that we were using, our technological innovation in data collection. And I watched half of them almost die. The first time we were using it pouring at the March for Science. And then the other one is down there where I'm talking to somebody at the Women's March. That's where I'm wearing my ski coat because it was cold, because it was January, because it was a Women's March. So
my wife was there.
Yeah, probably. So when I do go out in the field and collect data, I try very hard. Well, I collect data using a survey methodology, which has a very clear methodology. I do use teams to collect my data, where the only way for us to get good data that can be defensible in terms of understanding who's out in the streets, which we'd use this methodology to do a field approximation of random sampling in a crowd, right? You're not going to get a full random sample when there are, well, the March for Science was at 300,000 people, but whatever the case. So in order to make it work, everybody has to do their part and has to follow the methodology. So we have to do the sampling correctly, and we have to administer the survey correctly. And so while I care very deeply about these issues, I very much follow the methodology. And then I also write up based on what the findings are. I mean, I have to say my second book, which was called Activism, Inc., there was a lot of pushback and a lot of frustration from the people that I studied during that book, because I think they really thought that I was doing kind of a marketing campaign for them. And in that book, the findings were, I was studying canvassing on the left, and the way that canvassing, what I found was that canvassing was really burning through and turning off a lot of young people to progressive politics based on doing surveys and then open-ended semi-structured interviews. And everybody was very unhappy that I had negative findings, but I very much try to detach myself from my findings as I'm doing my data analysis, and I write up whatever's there. Now, I try to write it up in a way that is even-handed. What I did differently for Saving Ourselves is I bring together a lot of these studies to tell a broader story, and then I end by using it to advise and project forward. In some ways, I kind of think of it as it's my integrated modeling for activism in the future, right? Which is basically taking historical data and then projecting it forward to see which ways, what we know from history, what it will tell us about the future. So that was kind of my way of thinking about it. But when I do my research, and I have to say that I've talked to a number of groups that I study who are constantly trying to get me to glue myself to things, to throw food, to block, to crazy glue, etc. Nobody's ever asked me to get naked, thankfully, because I'm not going to do that either. But all of that being said, when I'm collecting my data, I very much am there as a researcher. And I think that's really important. Even though I care about the issue, for me to be able to collect the data, I can't be doing that kind of participant observation. Some people do that with their work, but it's just not my methodology.
I think I asked you one of the other shows you were on activism, whether you get pushback or do people sort of resist the negative findings that you come up with? Do you remember we were talking
really
about? Say again.
Some people don't like those. I mean, they don't like to hear negative things about their groups. I mean, my second book, there was a lot of pushback, and there was even efforts to try to stop the book from coming out because of the negative findings. And that was from the left. And in fact, there was some claims made that I was a right-wing plant trying to destroy the movement. And yet I persisted. So here we are now. That book came out in 2006, you know.
Yeah.
I'm still here.
Yeah, so here we are.
Stand by the findings, so there you have it.
Yeah, and here we are with the new book. And again, I've got the table of contents here as a way for people to sort of understand the themes that are in here. Maybe you could just kind of quickly run down those overarching sections.
Sure. Okay. So so the first chapter is very much about using a social scientific lens to talk about the climate crisis. But actually, let me take a step back and say the book is written to be very much for a trade audience. So it's for everyday people who care about climate change or want to know more about climate change. So what I do in the first chapter is actually build on some theoretical work that I wrote a couple of years ago with a colleague of mine that was actually published in the top social theory journal about understanding the society-environment relationship. And I basically take it and try to apply it in an accessible way to understanding what's going on with climate change today and the social side of the climate crisis. And so I start there, and then part of it is talking about how there are different actors involved in decision making that can play a role in outcomes around saving us or getting past the climate crisis. And that would be the state, the market, and civil society, right? So then chapter 2 looks at institutions. It looks at the long history of efforts for climate policymaking. I talk about the international arena, but then I also jump down into the United States because the book is very much talking about American politics and the role that American politics play both here in the United States, but also internationally, because we are the #1 polluter and contributor to climate change historically. And then I go from there to talking about civil society. When I should say in chapter 2, I also talk about the role that businesses have played in both encouraging incremental policymaking, but then also slowing process or progress when we think specifically about fossil fuel interests there. So I turn then to, in chapter 3, looking at civil society and thinking about how collective action can play a role and be the facilitator for getting us to the type of climate action that's needed. And I talk about, first of all, the way that collective action works. And then in chapter 4, I dig into data that I've collected from climate activists, including surveys and interviews with groups that are engaging in nonviolent civil disobedience. And I pull apart what has been thought of as this kind of generalized radical flank, or the folks who are just stopping traffic and throwing food and gluing, etc., smearing paint. And I pull that apart based on my conversations with them and the type of work they're doing and what their aims are, to understand that radical flank and how disruption is playing a role in climate activism. And then finally, in chapter 5, I come back to the main argument here, which is what is it going to take, and provide, based on the research I've done and the history, what it will take for kind of climate activism to get to a place where it could play a role in leading to the type of climate action that's needed. Yeah,
and that 5th section, we're going to go into a little more depth on a couple of these in a minute, because I've set up some thoughts. It really is your operational hypothesis for going forward is sort of a new kind of climate activism that's very community oriented and action oriented, not necessarily stopping things, but starting things. I'm excited by that, because I think I wrote a piece a year or two ago about, for journalism, the same thing is there. I think writing more articles just saying the world is warming and look what's happening in Greenland isn't really going to get us anywhere. But
I mean, I would just say, like, my experience with that is, there are only so many papers I want to write for peer review that say we need more research, we need to more understand why this is working the way it's working and what's not working. And so that's why I thought take some of the data and put it together to think about that. Yep.
That's good. That you start out. There's a section of the book in the beginning. You're talking about lessons from COVID and what you and a colleague call the anthro shift, which is what it would. I think maybe talk about the anthro shift. It seems to be where you get to a point, whether you call it a tipping point or not, a social tipping point, where there's a big mass of people who are working to shift a big part of the system. So what is the anthro shift, and what did we learn from COVID? I have some images here that show the COVID thing. It was so polarizing and toxic, and it took us back to 1918 when there was an anti-mask league and stuff. And so two things. What was the COVID? Is there something we could learn from COVID? And then what is the anthro shift idea?
Let me start with anthro shift first. So anthro shift is a theory that Andrew Jorgensen and I came up with to try to understand the ways that different social actors interact with one another to address environmental issues. And what we basically find is that anthro shift is, so we know that there are different social actors that interact with one another. We have the economic system, we have the political system, we have civil society, and they work in certain ways within society. And an anthro shift is when we see a reorientation of these actors. And the theory of anthro shift talks about how the reorientation is driven by a generalized sense of risk. And so we talk in the original paper about how the generalized sense of risk can come from disaster, which we know opens up windows of opportunities for new and innovative policy efforts, right? After a disaster hits, we see it after Hurricane Sandy or Hurricane Katrina. But we also see it when there was this generalized sense of risk that actually led us to the Trump administration. So it doesn't have to be about the environment, but specifically in the book, I talk about it with regard to the environment. And so it's a reorientation of the social actors, which can sometimes lead to better outcomes and sometimes cannot in terms of the society-environment relationship. And so I did write a follow-up paper to that by myself called Anthro Shift in a Warming World, which was published in Climate Action, the journal. And there I basically applied this theory more to COVID and thinking about how COVID worked. And basically what we learned from COVID is that, first of all, systemic change is possible. I mean, Greta Thunberg, and I have a quote from the beginning of this chapter from Greta Thunberg saying, what we learned here is that the kind of changes that everybody say can't happen, can happen, but there needs to be a huge political will. And the political will in our theory comes from this universalized sense of risk. And so within the pandemic, there was this sense of risk that was so strong that people went inside their houses and didn't come out again. I mean, people went inside, they shut down borders, we homeschooled, we baked a heck of a lot of bread, we wore masks, right? And then people got really frustrated and people got more comfortable or got sick of staying inside. And as that happened, there's the other paper. And as that happened, people started shifting back to the orientation of social actors that we had before. And this is, the anthro shift also says that things can change, but it's multi-directional, which means things can change back. We've seen a lot of this over time. And what I take from that in the new book is I take this idea that we need to have a risk that is so severe that it overwhelms the pushback, right? We saw for COVID in the beginning, the fear of getting sick or, making somebody in your family sick led other people, led everybody to be willing to go inside and wear masks and not send your kids to school. But over a certain period of time, people became inured to it. Some people got vaccinated, people got COVID, and this counter movement rose up, pushing for people to be able to, socially mix freely and not have to wear masks, et cetera, and so forth. That's very common. These kind of counter movements are very common during this period of time. And so what I find in it, and I learned from COVID for, the book, is that we need a severe and durable, feeling of risk or risk pivot that is so severe that people are willing to make the changes and keep the changes, even though it's going to hurt, right? I mean, nobody liked homeschooling. Nobody liked staying home and not seeing our family for the holidays. I mean, all of those things, and those things were the sacrifices we made to stay safe. And there needs to be a big enough social sense of threat from the climate crisis before people are going to be willing to make those kinds of changes. And that helps us, or helps me, to think about how bad it has to get before we're going to see this kind of generalized willingness and generalized feeling that we need to push policymakers to make the changes, right? Because some of these changes are going to hurt.
Yeah. That brings to mind lots of questions. One is about the work of George Marshall, who was this British climate campaigner and analyst who did a book, the title of which I can never remember, several years ago, after he had done a lot of work on, he had been in the United States after the fires east of Austin, Texas. In 2010, I wrote about this, the Labor Day fires in Bastrop County. And one of the conclusions of his work was that experience with a disaster tended to make people more of who they already were. In other words, if you were, if you're a survivalist, you're going to dig a deeper trench and buy more water and be more individualistic. And if you're a communitarian, you're going to be out there volunteering more. So does that cut against the idea? I mean, obviously that's just a hypothesis on his part, but that seems to me as a journalist to cut against the idea of a unified theory of social change.
Well, I think it does. I don't know George Marshall, and I don't know his work. It sounds like a case study based on,
it's more case study than empirical.
What I would say is that, the theory builds on quite extensive research post-disaster around the world that talks about these windows of opportunity opening where policy making can become innovative and really take on systemic change. And I think that the idea that civil society will push for that, I think, will only happen. I mean, one of the things that I frequently get from journalists is they say, well, but climate activists, there aren't that many of them right now. And that's absolutely true, right? Climate activism is not anywhere near mass mobilization, right? What we have is like what I would think of as a very performative vanguard right now. But the question is, if things get really bad, as a lot of scientists are predicting they will we see civil society rise up and push government to act? And the examples we've seen from disasters that have taken place around the world and in specific areas in the United States suggest that will actually happen, because we do see there being pressure for more support from the government, et cetera, and so forth. And that tends to happen after disasters.
You and that chunk of your book really brought to mind the work of Sam Montano. I'm not sure if you must have interacted with her at some point. She's a disasterologist. That's her self.
Her book is somewhere right over here.
Yeah.
She's good. She's really good.
Well, I've had her on before, and she's trying to build a concept she calls disaster justice, which is distinct from climate justice. She thinks it's a wider phenomenon where people who are marginalized and not the first in line to get aid, billionaires, as I've written in a piece I show here, are the ones who have the lawyers and the consultants who can find the FEMA money to bolster their beaches far faster than those who don't have money and access can get what really is needed, which is heat resilience and getting vulnerable people out of floodplains and the like. So this, I actually reached out to her, hoping she might be able to come on the show to briefly talk about it. But I think getting you in a conversation with her and some of her disaster research colleagues might be interesting, because I think that concept has a lot of heft to it. And as you say, this is a widespread. The idea that FEMA is broken, that the country doesn't know how to deal with disasters, that whatever we do with emissions is going to take time to catch up with the rate at which things are happening in vulnerable places. So that may be something.
Yeah, I mean, I follow Sam. I think she's fabulous, and I think these ideas they're absolutely necessary, and they're going to become more necessary, right? I mean, what El Nino is waning, but we are off the charts, and so this summer is going to be bad. I mean, here in DC, I don't know what it's like in Maine, but here in DC, I'm looking at the buds for the cherry blossoms. We've got flowers blooming. I mean, we are definitely in early April kind of territory, and it's the first week of March. So
it's been ridiculous up here this winter, even more so than
last. And it's really it's fine now. I mean, I'm a fan of winter, but it's fine now. But it's not going to be fine in August. It's not going to be fine at all. And people who don't have air conditioning and people who have to work outside are gonna feel it. And it's going to be even worse and places get hotter.
Yeah. So let's talk about a core idea that you explore in the book and that we talked about on the show and you mentioned earlier, is this radical flank, which is that having these in-your-face activists on the edges of these questions and in the heart of the media picture can be beneficial to the mainstream movement ultimately. Rob Willer was kind of pushing back on this, even though he co-authored this paper, which says that can increase support for moderate factions. But he made the point on the show and in some Twitter exchanges we already talked about before, that the radical flank effect only works if the general populace is aware that there's more dimensions to the climate movement than just the people they're seeing on the screen. And I don't know, let's just talk about that a little bit. I mean, Greta Thunberg, she can be active on the edge, but I think now she's kind of mainstreamed.
Actually, so if usually we define the radical flank based on the types of tactics that are being used. So Greta has shifted her tactics to be much more radical. She's engaging in nonviolent civil disobedience. She's getting arrested. So she has transitioned to be part of the radical flank. But I would just say that, so Rob's paper, as well as there are numerous papers that show very clearly the ways that a radical flank draws attention to an issue, the goal of the radical flank, and these performative actions, most of which you have up on here on the screen, these performative actions are specifically, and you ask the activists themselves, they'll say this without pause, are aiming to get media attention. And the point is that when they get the media attention, people will pay attention and they will likely, those who are sympathizers may then sign up. And we've seen lots of evidence of this. There's been evidence of it during this women's suffrage. There's evidence of it during civil rights. There's evidence of it more recently. And actually a really good anecdotal piece of evidence is what happened during this past summer when at the US Open, there were folks from Extinction Rebellion who came to the US Open. One gentleman whom I got to meet while I was in New York at my book launch, he actually crazy glued his foot to the stadium, like literally smack onto the cement or whatever it was, and basically held up play. And people were apoplectic. I ended up being on TMZ Live. I was asked to go on TMZ Live, which I'd never gone before. I was trying to figure out, I was being punked when I got asked to go on TMZ Live. But here was the thing that was very interesting about it is, first and foremost, so in terms of getting media attention, there were activists, and I was telling this to the folks on TMZ Live, there were activists who did the exact same tactic at the Open here in DC less than a month before, except for nobody crazy glued themselves. They just went in, they unfurled the banner, and then they were asked to leave, and that was the end of it, and they got no news. In contrast, all of a sudden at the US Open, we have this person using this performative, disruptive tactic, not confrontational. I mean, he only disrupted, disrupted the event. He was confrontational to his skin on his foot is all he was. And he had to be removed. And so they had to pause play. Like everybody got to see the tennis match.
Right.
But what was very interesting is Coco herself actually made a statement afterwards saying, I do not support this type of disruptive activism, but I support the climate movement. And that was consistent across messages about that. And that is like classic textbook radical flank, right?
Well, actually, the quote you just read is a demonstration of that, just very clearly.
Exactly. And so it was funny because I was on TMZ Live and they're like, isn't this terrible? And I was like, well, the point, if you asked those protesters what they were doing, they would have said they came to get media attention. And I am on TMZ Live. So that's pretty clearly they got the media attention they wanted. And they also got sympathizers to say they care about the issue, even though they don't support that activism.
Yeah.
So it worked quite well. I mean,
and there was a paper, I was scouring the literature a little bit before the show, and this paper from a few years back was, I love it. Bill McKibben, the title of the paper is Bill McKibben's Influence on U.S. Climate Change Discourse, Shifting Field Level Debates Through Radical Flank Effects. And
yep.
This is a lot more subtle than gluing feet to the U.S. open field, but it's about the divestment movement and how I love this line. What we find is that as these new actors and issues entered the debate, liberal policy ideas such as carbon tax, which had previously been marginalized in the U.S. debate, gained increased attention and legitimacy, while the divestment effort itself gained limited traction. In other words, the divestment, they're saying the divestment push had these secondary influence that if you're just counting universities, you're missing the point. And I think
right. It was the broader discourse. I mean, I've cited this paper on numerous occasions, so I know it well. I mean, another example more recently about Bill McKibben's influence is his founding of Third Act, which is one of the groups that is mobilizing retirees to engage in climate activism, including nonviolent civil disobedience around the climate crisis. I'm actually speaking to the DMV branch of them this afternoon to talk to them about kind of the work they're doing. But I mean, there's there's no question that he has had a huge influence from pipeline protests to founding groups, et cetera, in terms of in the radical flank. And I mean, at the same time, he also played a role in calling off the big protest that was supposed to happen at the Department of Energy after the LNG pause. So, anybody who thinks he's not particularly radical, I mean, he is, he is engaging. That's why it's so funny, because a lot of people are like, radical, because, and I'm using my air quotes here, because in a lot of ways, these are not particularly radical tactics. And what I do talk about in the book is the way that these are the beginning to what might end up radicalizing more. But right now, it's just radical in contrast to the other types of actions that are being taken.
Right. What's your take on scientists becoming activists? There's the Peter Kalmus approach, Climate Human on Twitter, 400,000 followers or something. And there's lots of pushback and turmoil within the scientific community about whether that's ultimately a self goal, meaning, working against the issues or not.
Well, I mean, so I know a lot of the people who are involved in Scientist Rebellion, and I think, well, first of all, I can understand why some scientists are just so frustrated with continuing work in labs, finding more and more evidence that the climate is changing and that things are going to get really bad, and not seeing enough political action, right, that's sufficient to address the problem. So my sense is, I mean, first of all, they've asked me a couple times to participate with them, and that is not my lane. As I said, my job is to study them, and I have been at events where I've studied them. I think Peter took one of my surveys at one point last spring. But more importantly, I think that I don't know. There's been some research that talks about how the individual scientists, the more active they get, the less their findings are well received by the general public. And I don't know. I mean, I think there's a lot more research that needs to be done about this. I do think that, it is an interesting message to recognize the way that a lot of scientists are starting to be frustrated with continuing to do their work and seeing findings that get worse and worse. And yet we do not have climate action. So my philosophy is, I think, generally speaking, I think, is an all the above kind of climate activism is needed. So everybody who feels like they want to and feels the need to push back against power should think about what they're comfortable doing, and they should do it, because it's all going to be needed before we get to the other side.
Yeah, I've made this point before about there's a body of science that grew out of the work of Thomas Elmqvist at Stockholm Environment Institute. In 2003, he did a paper with others on resilience in ecosystems, coming more from the diversity of responses to an environmental stress than the diversity of species within the ecosystem. So what you want is response diversity. And that became a phrase. And I glommed onto it in 2011 when Bill McKibben and I were kind of arguing about Keystone, whether Keystone was, particularly that year, saddling Obama with the Keystone decision in the run up to re-election. I was writing it seemed like a bad idea. And of course, Bill was saying, well, if you're not down here in prison with me, you're actually not part of the solution. So I was like Googling for stuff related to the environmental movement and diversity responses. Can we all understand we're working to the same goal, but we have different approaches? And that's when I found his paper. And I went, oh my God, resilient. You want this. You want the wild rumpus in the kids' book.
Yeah, I mean, but I think not only do you want the wild rumpus, I mean, it's just funny to me that, we have so many leaders who are saying we need an all of the above energy strategy, but they don't want to say, I mean, people don't want to recognize that we need an all of the above, engagement and activism strategy, because I don't know which type of activism is going to be most effective. I mean, I would love to do that research. I've written many papers. You've seen them. We've talked about them on your podcast before, saying we need to do more research to understand that. But in the meantime, what would be most valuable is for everybody to get involved however they feel comfortable. And if it is about mucking and gutting after a hurricane, or helping put, solar panels on public schools, or changing light bulbs, whatever it is, it's all necessary. So, yeah.
And it's the human way.
Yeah. I mean, and I think that also I don't think we're going to get through this by some sort of command and control type of policy from the top down. And I certainly don't think it's going to happen with a similar kind of a model from the bottom up. And it doesn't work that way. I mean, I was just on this panel about whether democracy can survive climate change. And there is this alternative, which is that there ends up being, an autocratic ruler who just basically fixes the world and we all just have to live with it. Sure, that's another option, but I'm not pushing for that option. I'm not sure how that option comes about, but it's not going to be good, whatever it is, to get us there. So
no, that wouldn't be the way I would want to get there.
For sure.
Because I guarantee it wouldn't be the option. Well, I actually, Kim Stanley Robinson, I've had some discussions about that very thing, and there was a paper, a German social scientist whose name I'm forgetting, wrote a big paper on democracy and climate maybe 7 or 8 years ago. And he said, the last thing you want is to constrain democracy for the sake of climate.
I mean, I think that it will inherently limit innovation, which, I mean, it's not that I'm against technological innovation. If we could figure out a way to innovate ourselves out of this crisis, I'd be perfectly happy to support it. I'm just saying, in the meantime, everybody should be doing everything they can to try to help, move the needle, because the needle needs to be moved.
There was a section in your book on the 3.5 effect. Is there you're writing, many climate activists have become preoccupied with the idea that there's this magic number out there. If we just get through that threshold, then big things will change. But you kind of have however, this is one of your sort of cold shower moments. So what do you think about this general idea of sufficiency?
Well, I mean, first and foremost, I want to just say that, Erica and I have Erica Chenoweth, who wrote the book originally where the 3.5 rule came from. I mean, Erica and I have co-authored together. I think she's a wonderful scholar. She herself has written about how the number, which came from autocratic societies, was never meant to be prescriptive. That all being said, I mean, I think we don't know how many people need to be in the street. And it's interesting because I have done talks lately where I have somebody who's like, but how many? How many people? I mean, how many people need to be in the streets? How many people need to die before people are in the streets? And we don't know the answers to that. Those are really interesting empirical questions. But, I am an empiricist at heart. So even though I did write, a well-documented manifest, or at least I feel like it is, I still feel like I can't say and answer that. I can tell you the social dynamics that are most likely here, and we will most likely see people rising up to push back against the crisis, which is a common response to disaster when there isn't the support that's needed and to risk. But I don't know that we'll see 3.5% of the population in the streets. I think that would be a lot. We have not seen that in the United States before. I think we will see a lot of people taking action. And I mean, I think about, you know, all of the people who came out after George Floyd was murdered all across the country. And to me, as somebody who studies activism and I was doing a project for the Russell Sage Foundation at the time about how the activism was similar and different in different parts of the country. It was remarkable to me. I mean, it's been well documented to be the largest sustained mobilization of Americans in the history of the United States. And that wasn't wasn't 3.5%, wasn't 12 plus million people, but it was a sustained action that made people take notice. Right. And I think that is the thing that's really worth, you know, focusing on here. It's about action and mobilization that isn't performative. It isn't about a Saturday with a permit. It's about getting in the streets and pushing for social change, which doesn't usually happen when people come out just for a Saturday with a permit, you know?
Yeah, I couldn't agree more. You have your closing point in the book is about embedding climate activism in community rather than yelling at strangers. And I, you know, there was some, I just read something about some very popular book from like 20 years ago by Pittman, or it's a P name, about community, the power of community. And it resonates with me a lot now, particularly because of with the Inflation Reduction Act body of money and also the infrastructure law, the bipartisan infrastructure law. We're talking about hundreds of billions of dollars. And I had a conversation on here. It was actually before the IRA was passed. It was after the Inflation Reduction Act was passed with Jigar Shah, who runs
it was after the bipartisan infrastructure bill was passed, is what you meant, right?
Yeah, and he runs this giant loan chunk of the Department of Energy.
At DOE, right?
And he said something here. I think I want to play it for you because it's so beautifully, to me, summarizes, I think, the point you're making in your book. So hold on one second while I pull up that clip. I'm going to do it this way because of some complexities with StreamYard. I don't think I can do it off of the computer. Oh yeah, here we go. Just it's like 1 minute, and then give me your thoughts.
Thousands, actually tens of thousands of people who are already active on these issues. When you think about what this takes, we have 19,500 organized cities and towns and communities in this country. That's it, 19,500. 14,500 of them have a population that's less than 5,000, right? And so what this requires is sustained effort at the local level, always, right? When the transit authority makes the decision to replace old diesel buses with something else, they need to choose electric buses. And we have programs to pay for it. But if the transit agency doesn't apply for the program, it doesn't happen. And I can't force them to do it from the federal government. All I can do is say, here are all of the resources. But someone in local community can force them to make a decision that's in their own best financial interest. The same thing's true with the way in which school buses are done. You know, only 50% of streetlights in this country are LED. We could replace all the rest of the streetlights with LED lights. It's like an 8-month payback, right? The amount of school rooftops that don't have solar on them, when it's fully financeable and you save money from day one, right? I mean, what it takes is someone who actually is willing to spend a few extra hours every week to say, you know what, I want to make my community better. And the federal government's passed $1.2 trillion to support that, but we can't force it top down. That's not how our country works, right? It's got to be forced at the local level with resources that we provide to that, you know, change maker and that muckraker.
So, I mean, what does that feel like when you hear that in the context of what you were thinking?
I would just say, so the last point, the final point in my book is I say, you know, even though I talk a lot about activists, I say everybody doesn't have to be an activist. And one of the main things that's needed is we need to cultivate resilience in our communities. And
Right.
that is about both environmental and social resilience. And that's what Jigar Shah is talking about right here.
Right.
It's about people taking responsibility to improve their communities, right? And to connect with our communities. And I have to say that one of the things that I am constantly harping on my students about right now, since I'm teaching an activism class, is that it is very hard to go from here. I'm just going to do my little here to go from, this is me like going through, that was me TikToking, by the way, in case you couldn't tell, to go from that to actually doing what Jigar's talking about, which is building stuff in your community. And I think that it's become a harder task, even though building this kind of resilience in your community is absolutely what's needed, because first of all, that's where we can really make that kind of changes that are necessary. But it also is assuming that the natural scientists are right. And I'm not a natural scientist, but I believe them and I support the science that they do, just like hopefully they support the science I do. If the climate shocks that are expected are coming, lots and lots of towns are going to need to have more ways to produce energy. They're going to need to have more capacity to handle extreme heat, extreme weather, atmospheric rivers, flooding, et cetera, and so forth. And there are all of these programs that exist where people can build out in their communities, and we should take advantage of them. And I mean, and that's the main, you know, that's the last point I have, is that I think that investing in community, I mean, it's interesting because, you know, in American Resistance, which was my last book, I talked a lot about the promise and peril of distributed organizing, which was all about the ways that lots of groups have used technology to bypass the fact that they have no local infrastructure on the left. And while it's good because you can reach out to strangers, just like that line there says, yelling at strangers is not nearly as good as working with neighbors. It does mean, though, that if we're thinking about, you know, blue, red, and purple America, that yelling at strangers who are not local to you and telling them who to vote for, I mean, that's what we've been doing. That's the way that politics has been happening in our country. And it's not, well, it's not sustainable. And I'm not sure it's the best way to do politics. I think that it would be much more valuable for everybody to take the time to invest in their own community.
Absolutely. And the other thing, even way back, you mentioned your work early, you know, under the Clinton years, and then the climate bill that you and I both remember and everyone else forgets. I interviewed Steve Schneider, a great natural scientist, physical scientist, you know, who was he had spent, in 2007, he'd spent some time in Australia. He gave a speech there about efficacy, and he's talked about sequencing policy steps and how small, almost demonstration projects at the local level can build wider reverberations and sort of potentially even bipartisan support for actions that, but you start small, start with the sustained work on whether it's LED lights. And then I've done this, these pieces on the social power of energy efficiency. If you save energy loss from your house by insulating it, and you put that information on Facebook, you're helping to convey an opportunity to your neighbors, that kind of thing. And it all sounds so damn incremental, you know. It's not system change. There are even signs. What do the signs say? System change, not climate change. And we all want that. Ultimately, the system we're in is really broken in so many ways. So how do you talk to activists knowing that system change is needed, but trying to convince them that these incremental local steps are a pathway to that bigger thing? Is that, assuming you think that that's a workable hypothesis?
Well, I think that that's part of the solution for sure. I do want to say one thing on Steve Schneider is that I actually, as part of the Climate Policy Network work that I've been doing for many years, I interviewed Steven Snyder. He was the last interview I did for this project, and I was the last interview he gave before he passed away, unfortunately, on his way back from the conference where I interviewed him. And he was just an amazing man. And we had actually started the interview here in DC. He was here doing something at the AAAS. And then we were both going to the same conference. And so he said, we'll continue the interview in Gothenburg in Sweden. So we did the interview there, and then unfortunately, I mean, he passed away on the plane on the way home, and it was just such a loss. But so I'm happy to hear you bring up his work. I mean, here's what I've been trying to push at and suggest to activists. I mean, and yes, I think that it takes everybody doing everything for us to get to the other side of climate crisis. I do talk about in the book the ways that the activists who are engaging in, using disruption and confrontational activism as part of a campaign that is broader than that. And I use a divestment campaign. I use a Harvard divestment as an example. I talk about the work that Third Act is doing. These are examples of activism that's embedded in community, right? And embedded in real local action. It's not just getting media attention for a performative protest. And I think those will have the most reverberations that will have more effects and could build more than just throwing soup, right? And so, but at the same time, if people want to throw soup, there is evidence that throwing soup does do something as well. So, I mean, I'm not trying to discredit people from doing whatever it is they want to do, but I'm just saying that if you only have so much time to do stuff, anything that actually can build roots into your community. And, it's interesting. At one point, I had this conversation with some of the young people who were involved in Fridays for Future, and I suggested that while they were pushing for system change and going to one of the rounds of climate negotiation, it would be really cool if they all decided to make some commitments to take some individual actions, right? And this was when I was working with the IPCC, and I was like, it'd be so cool. And then we could try to calculate how much CO2 you saved by doing these individual actions while also pushing for system change, which is longer and slower. And I got a real pushback from them because they said, we are not letting the focus be on us and our individual actions. We want to focus still on system change. So we don't want to do that. And while I understood their message, I mean, and I would say this to all activists, I think we need to all do everything we can. And part of it is doing these incremental changes in our neighborhoods. I mean, how wonderful would it be for us to all have electric school buses? Yeah. Think of how much better air quality we would have. Sure. I mean, I would love it if our local schools had solar panels, right? So doing that kind of work, which is incremental, while also pushing for the broader systemic change, it's a win-win. I mean, there's no loss there. I don't see why people wouldn't want to do it. So as far as I'm concerned, it's going to take all of us doing everything to save ourselves from the worst of the climate crisis, because we know from the scientific models that we're staring very close to the edge of this precipice, right? With a whole bunch of cascading effects that are coming. So we need to be pushing for social cascading effects, and some of them are incremental and in our communities. But I do think that if the worst of the climate crisis hits us, as some of the models say they will, anybody who spends the time building the resilience in your communities, the social and the environmental resilience, is going to be so much better off when the disaster hits. So why not build that kind of community resilience now?
Oh, absolutely. Boy, and there's so much more we could talk about, but we're kind of at the end of the hour. You're recalling for me something else that happened in COVID, where a plastics campaign in Bhopal in India transformed itself overnight into a food distribution network when the lockdown happened. And I happen to know one of the sister of one of the people involved with that was at Columbia University. She put me in touch with them. And this is in the early weeks, just the early days of the lockdown there. And the agility of that group and going from what it perceived as its core issue, waste reduction in India, to food distribution when all the poor people in that town couldn't leave home to make $1 a day sweeping streets, shows that potential to really then gain respect and trust across a community, doing what at the core of your being is the thing you really want to do, which is to advance society. So and there's lots of this in your book. I hope it is read widely, but particularly by people in the climate movement. Saving Ourselves from Climate Shocks to Climate Action, but by my friend Dana R. Fisher. Great to have you on here again, and maybe again sometime. Good luck with everything you're doing going forward. And we're probably going to do a session on qualitative science too. You saw that discussion on Twitter, on X. How can that gain respect with people like the media? is
Right. I mean, we can do another one. Lisa and I were chatting about it after you posted it. So yeah, there's lots to say there. I mean, and I think, one of the things that I do, for what it's worth, is, I'm a mixed methodologist. So I do both extensive quantitative analysis, and then I use the qualitative to get more, in depth into the how and the why, which you'll see if you read Saving Ourselves. So
yeah, no, I've enjoyed it. I highly recommend it. And the thing you're also talking about, the thing that needs to happen is a lot more cross-disciplinary conversations. We did that with that IPCC session we did 2 years ago, and it was just great. So getting those quote unquote natural scientists to talk to social scientists.
No, it was wonderful. I agree, and I loved it. So I'm in for it if you want to do it again. But thank you so much for the conversation, and the conversation was great. I love the example. That last example is exactly the kind of stuff that I think we need to do and recognize about building in our community. So it was a great example.
Super. Hey, thanks, Dana. And anyone watching, or later when you are done with this, you can share it. This video gets archived right away on Facebook, YouTube, LinkedIn, etc. And you can get in touch with me through that distracting scrolling bar at the bottom. Do subscribe if you can. I'm doing this completely voluntary at this point. I left Columbia University last July, so this is just my own little way of interacting with the world, and I would like to keep at it. Thanks again. We'll talk soon.